Well, the less said about basketball, the better. We could be here all night talking about Vin Scully and still not exhaust all the superlatives that rightly apply. But to me, the thing I like best about Vin is that he still refers to me as that promising newcomer. And why not? He announced, as has been noted about a week ago, that next year he'll be back for his 66th season. The only Americans who have a job for life are Supreme Court justices, Vin Scully, and Donald Sterling's attorneys. All of us, at least all of us in the business, in some way, have some personal connection to Vin Scully. I don't know why I didn't know this until a couple of years ago, and I stumbled across the fact that Vin Scully and my father were born on the same day. Not the same birthday, exactly the same day, November 29th, 1927. And like a lot of kids, especially kids who grew up in the 50s and 60s, baseball was a bond between me and my dad. And I grew up in New York, and I've spent a good part of my adult life in St. Louis. But when I was 8 and 9 years old, we lived in Redondo Beach. And so we moved, and the moving vans came to Long Island and took our belongings away. And my mother and my sister flew out ahead to prepare things, but we had to get the car across country. And so I drove with my dad. He did the driving. I was 8. And he and I drove across country, a 5-day trip in 1960 through an America that was very different than the one we'd find today. In some sense, less homogenized. There wasn't a Starbucks on every corner, or an Applebee's or a McDonald's. And so each area had its own distinctive feel as the terrain and the landscape changed. But from Pennsylvania to Ohio to Indiana to Illinois to Missouri and on, what stitched it together was baseball on the radio. It was summertime, and I would get to sit there while my dad drove and told me baseball stories, and we compared players and ideas about the game, and I would fiddle with the radio dial like a safecracker, trying to pull in a distant broadcast. Bob Prince on KDKA in Pittsburgh, Ernie Harwell on WJR in Detroit, Bob Elson calling the White Sox games, the great team of Harry Carey and Jack Buck on KMOX in St. Louis. And as this long trip began to near its conclusion, I guess we got as far as Nevada. And through the crackle and static came the most distinctive voice of all. And I can still hear my dad, who passed away when I was a senior in high school in 1970, but I could still hear him on that summer night in 1960 say, "We're getting closer. That's Vin Scully." That's the first time I ever heard Vin Scully's voice. It's a memory that connects me to the game and to my dad, a memory that I will never forget. And I became one of those proverbial youngsters, and there are, to hear them tell a story, probably millions of them, who grew up in Southern California before modern technology allowed you to tap into any broadcast from anywhere. I had the transistor radio under the pillow with the lights out, my mom and dad thinking I was asleep, and I was listening to Vin Scully and Jerry Doggett. And so you can imagine the thrill that it was when years and years later, in the early 1980s, fate placed me at NBC hosting the pregame show before the World Series. And after setting the scene and talking about my favorite sport and the biggest stage of that sport, to me, the single biggest thrill of that night was to utter the line, turning it over to the play-by-play booth where Vin was working with Joe Garagiola. And now, here's Vin Scully. Some 20 years later, I'm interviewing Ray Charles. Now think about this. Ray Charles, and by the way, he has a connection to two people in this room. Sugar Ray Leonard, his given name is Ray Charles Leonard. And in the rematch with Roberto Duran at the Superdome in New Orleans in 1980, the fight was over as soon as the great Ray Charles sang "America the Beautiful," and the whole place went crazy. It was at that point that Duran decided to say "no mas." And Jamie Foxx, he didn't just play Ray Charles, he was Ray Charles, in one of the most startling performances in a biopic that you could ever imagine. So here I am interviewing Ray Charles, one of the great artists of the century. And at one point, Ray says to me, "You know who I'd like to meet?" And I'm thinking, who could it possibly be? You're Ray Charles. You probably met everybody. He said, "I would love to meet Vin Scully. Can you introduce me to Vin Scully?" He said, "Bob, you have to remember, the picture means nothing to me. Only the sound matters. And Vin Scully's broadcasts have a melody to them." And so it took a few years, but we arranged it. And I brought Ray to Dodger Stadium. And of course, Vin was very respectful of Ray's status, and he knew Georgia and Born to Lose and What I Say, and he talked to Ray Charles about it. But it was not an equal exchange. Vin appreciated the occasion. Ray was overjoyed. He was like a kid sitting next to Vin Scully. "Tell me again about Sandy Koufax's perfect game. Tell me about Kirk Gibson's home run." Ray Charles, that's what Vin Scully meant to him. Sports broadcasting is a craft. To do it well is harder than it looks. Not that many have mastered that craft. Fewer still, truly a select few, have elevated that craft to an art form. But that's what Vin Scully has been doing now for 6.5 decades.